All right. Well, let's dive right in. Here's the notes. And as you can see, the Poetic Analysis is where we are in the process, and we're going to be spending a few weeks there focusing our attention on the various steps. And let me just remind you of those steps. The reading of the poem or the text that we're focusing on, then identifying the setting and structure, which is what we finished last week. And then we began examining the parallelism in each verse. The fourth step is identifying the imagery, the poetic devices, and then summarizing the theme of the poem as well as each stanza. And let me just remind us from our time last week when we finished looking at the setting. Just want to highlight a couple of things before we dive into the parallelism aspect. From this psalm, Psalm 99, again, the author was not mentioned specifically, though we did talk about David as being a very strong possibility. The recipients are the Israelites, as indicated by the references to Moses, Aaron, and Samuel, and also the focus on temple worship. And so that's focus there. But notice the first two verses as we get into the psalm actually do focus on the world, and then the rest of the psalm addresses people of Israel. When it was written, again, the possibilities were somewhere between the time of David all the way up to the plundering of the temple by Babylon. Does anyone remember why we figured out that was the window? Does anyone remember that discussion? Maybe we need to read the psalm again. Why don't we do that? Let me go ahead and just scroll down to the psalm. We'll read it together, and then we'll come back to that. It's somewhere down here. Oh boy, all right, let's do this. Let's do this. Give me a moment, please. I'm going to pull up. Okay. Let's go ahead and just read through this, and then we'll review quickly the setting. We'll do 3 verses each like last time. I'm going to ask Pastor Jen if he could do verses 1 to 3, read those, and then Pastor Jason, 4 to 6, and then Pastor Tabs, 7 through 9. All right? Okay, Pastor John.
Psalms 99 verses 1 to 3. The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, and he is exalted above all peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he.
The strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them.
You need to unmute yourself, Brother Tabs.
Yeah. Okay, sound check. Okay. He spoke to them in the pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies and the statute that he gave them. O Lord our God, you answered them. You are a forgiving God to them, and yet an avenger of their evil deeds. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy hill, for holy is the Lord our God.
Okay, thank you. So again, we notice at the beginning of the psalm, there's no title. Titles often give some helpful background information, so we can't be certain about the author. But as we discussed last time, we can identify a window in which this psalm was likely written from the time of the reign of King David until the time when the Babylonians plundered Jerusalem and the temple in particular. And so I asked the question, how could we be sure of that? Or how would we know that? What were some of the clues in the psalm that would tell us it was in that range of times, written somewhere in that range of time? Does anyone remember?
Zion.
Pastor Robbie?
The mention of the word Zion
Okay.
might be a clue.
We have Zion here in verse 2. Brother Harris, what?
Yeah, and the other one was probably a reference to the Ark Pastor. He is enthroned above the cherubim.
Okay. And also the reference to his footstool, which David described in 1 Chronicles 28 as the ark, actually. I think I misspoke last week and said it was the temple. It specifically is the ark there in 1 Chronicles 28. In fact, let me just show you that passage since I've got this open. David was speaking of the temple, and in verse 2, he says, it says, the text, King David rose to his feet and said, "Listen to me, my brethren and my people. I had intended to build a permanent home for the ark of the covenant of God, for the footstool of our God. So I had made preparations to build it." He describes the ark as God's footstool there in just a parallel statement. So I think David here in Psalm 99 is referring to the ark. When he speaks of God being enthroned above the cherubim, we talked about that picture on the ark of the cherubim with their wings touching one another, touching the mercy seat that was in the middle, and God's presence would dwell above the mercy seat at times. And so the ark was a reference to where God dwelt. And so this picture of enthroned above the cherubim, the reference to his footstool, worshiping there, also the reference to Zion, I think these indicate that this psalm was written when the ark was in Jerusalem. And that time period was David was the one who brought the ark into Jerusalem, 1 Chronicles 16. And that is where it stayed until the Babylonians came and plundered the temple. And they destroyed everything in the temple. And that was around 586 was the third wave of their attacks. So we know it was in that window. Now, last week, though, I talked about that it was likely we could make a strong case for it being actually written during the time of King David, and perhaps not long after or even during the time when the ark was brought into the tabernacle. At that time, they didn't have a temple. Solomon built the temple building, but David did erect the tabernacle in Jerusalem, and he brought the ark there in 1 Chronicles 16. And as we read in 1 Chronicles 16, there's this song that David had Asaph sing for the people. And in that song, we see several statements that we find in Psalm 96 and Psalm 98, and some it appears in Psalm 99. And these psalms were grouped together, I think, because the person that was compiling the psalms recognized these psalms were connected to each other, not just in theme, but also perhaps by the occasion in which they were written. And so I think we could make a good case for the fact that actually David authored this psalm, and it was in the occasion of the tabernacle having been, the ark being brought to the tabernacle. It would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it, that he's speaking in verse 1, he says God's enthroned above the cherubim, and that picture of the ark being carried by the priests into the tabernacle. You know, the people could see that, and this cry out of God being enthroned above the cherubim, I think, I think going through this psalm, I believe that it's a strong possibility it came at that time. We can't be certain. There's no explicit statement given in the psalm that tells us this, but with that information, understanding 1 Chronicles 16, seeing the references here to the ark, recognizing the similarities between Psalm 96 and Psalm 98 and 1 Chronicles 16, I think that would be my best guess as far as when this psalm was written. Hopefully you guys remember that. Are there any questions about that? We did talk about it last week, but okay. So in going back to a review of our setting, let me pull that file back up. Good morning, Atong. Good morning, Dr. Quinn. Good to see you. Okay. Hello. Let me take you back to setting. You already talked about those items. The type of psalm, an enthronement psalm, that one that focuses on the sovereign rule of Yahweh, and we see those in Psalm 93 to Psalm 99. And then the outline we also discussed last week, if you'll remember. There appear to be 3 stanzas in this psalm, because that phrase, statement, holy is he or holy is Yahweh, comes at verse 3, at verse 5, and verse 9. So that appears to be a refrain in the psalm. Secondly, we talked about last week the pattern that appears in each of those stanzas, where the first part of the stanza is more of an indicative, making statements about God. And then the stanza ends in the last verse with an imperative, how to respond. Verse 3, let them praise. Verse 5, exalt and worship. Verse 9, exalt and worship. And then also, there appears to be a specific focus on 3 different ideas or truths about God in each of those stanzas. The first one on his greatness, the second stanza on his justice, and the third on his mercy. So I believe it's pretty clear that the structure of this psalm, there's 3 stanzas that are here. And we'll verify that as we go along. But early on, the New King James Version seems to have the correct outline of the psalm. All right, so we covered that last week. And then following that, we then talked about parallelism, the step of parallelism. That's the next step in our poetic analysis. The first is to read and observe. The second is to identify the setting, the outline of the psalm. And then the third step in the poetic analysis is to then examine the parallelism. Who can remind us of parallelism, what that is, what it means? Does anybody want to help remind us? Maybe I'll ask Brother Manny. Parallelism, Brother Manny. When we say parallelism in Hebrew poetry, what are we talking about?
Parallelisms it is a characteristic of Hebrew poetry where one or 2 or more lines are somewhat connected to each other.
Yeah.
Related to each other.
Yeah, very good. That's a great description. 2 or 3 lines within a verse
Yes.
are connected to one another. They have a relationship with one another. And we looked at 5, really 3 primary descriptions or types of relationships. And then we had 2 others at the end. The synonymous relationship, where the second line repeats the first. The contrastive, where the second line contrasts the first. Developmental, where one line develops another line. And it does that in 3 ways. It either adds to it, illustrates it, or gives the reason or result. And then we had another category that's when the connection's not clear. And we called that the Obi-Wan for you guys. The Ewan, right? This we don't know. So the Obi-Wan category. And then finally chiasms, where the second line of a verse is in reverse order grammatically compared to the first. All right. So those are the types. Now what I want to do this week is we're going to go through several examples. I'm just going to pick on each of you and just have you identify. I want you to read the verse and then identify the kind of parallelism that you see there, and then we'll talk about it. All right. So we'll start with let's see who read. We'll start with Pastor Renee. And brother, I'd like you to read this proverb 10:12 and then identify what kind of parallelism you see there. Okay?
Proverbs chapter 10, verse 12. Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all transgression. It is developmental. Sorry.
Right. You're going first, so you get lots of grace.
I mean, it is contrastive.
Contrastive. And what tells us that? What do you see there that shows us that it's contrastive?
Um, the opposite, hatred being contrasted to love.
Yeah, notice hatred, love, those are opposites, right? And then notice stirs versus covers, right? And then strife and transgressions are the same. And then notice too, that word but here, the translation includes that. That's a contrastive word. So we have the opposites here. Hatred stirs up strife. Love covers all transgressions. And then we have the word but there to help us out. So everyone see that? It's contrastive. These two lines are exactly opposite to one another. All right, good. Pastor Robbie, we'll have you do the next one.
He who troubles his own house will inherit wind, and the foolish will be servant to the wise-hearted. This is developmental.
Okay. What type? Remember there were 3 types.
It's an explanation, an expansion.
Okay, so what line is it?
The second line illustrates or explains the first line. Line 2 explains the first line.
Okay, explains the line. Oops. Okay, so he who troubles his own house will inherit wind. The foolish will be servant to the wise-hearted. So is line 2 explaining line 1? Is it expanding on line 1, or is it a result or purpose for line 1? You would say it explains it. It describes.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Everyone agree? Notice. Okay, go ahead, Brother Harris.
Yeah, I think it merely expands or adds, Pastor, to the second line adds to the first line.
Okay. Line 2 adds or expands. That's what Brother Harris mentioned. I would probably lean that way. Notice there's the term, the conjunction and.
Yeah.
So I think it is just adding more information. You know, it could be an explanation. You probably have to go and, because what we're saying then is that the foolish will be servant to the wise-hearted. If that's an explanation, then that's explaining what it means that he troubles his own house will inherit wind. But I think these are 2 different statements about the foolish. So I would probably lean towards expand or add as the likely type of developmental. All right. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Sometimes it's not exactly clear, and that's the reason we do this, is because knowing there is a relationship between the 2 lines, what we want to try to do is identify that relationship, and that's just like when we did block diagramming. It forces us to ask questions about what the author is doing. How is he connecting these 2 phrases? We know he is connecting them in some way because it's Hebrew poetry. But how is he doing that? And so the process of trying to figure that out will help us to better understand what's going on. It's an exercise to force us to ask questions of the passage. Okay, and so that's why we're doing this. And sometimes there are going to be maybe perhaps a couple of different possibilities, just like when we were diagramming. Sometimes there were situations where there could be 2 different words it's modifying, or how the phrase is modifying could be, we weren't sure at times. And so that will happen at times with parallelism, but knowing there is a connection and a relationship between these 2 lines this process is meant to help us think about it more carefully and try to understand what that relationship is. All right? All right, good. Pastor Entz, I'm going to give you Proverbs 13, verse 3.
Proverbs 13, verse 3. The one who guards his mouth preserves his life. The one who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. Synonymous.
Okay, and what
And
makes you
then,
say that? You're saying synonymous?
yeah,
Remember, that means line 2 repeats line 1. Is that what you see going on here?
I know. No.
Contrastive.
Guarding mouth and opening wide. It's contrast.
Yeah, it's contrast.
Contrast.
Okay, this is contrastive, actually.
Contrastive, yeah. Sorry.
And how do we see that here?
The first one, guarding his lips, guarding his mouth.
Yeah, guards
Verbs.
versus opens wide. Those are opposites, aren't they?
Yeah.
Okay, and then, yeah,
Yes.
what's the other part here you see?
Preserves and ruin.
Yeah, preserves and comes to ruin. Those are two opposites also, aren't they?
Yeah.
And we can see that here in the situation. There's one guy, he's guarding his mouth. And what happens to him? He preserves his life. There's another guy, and he's opening wide his lips. He's not being careful with what he says. He comes to ruin. So this is clearly contrastive. And notice here in the text, notice that we don't see the word but. Okay? You don't have to have the word but to be contrastive. Sometimes that is implied. Okay? And we see that, they could have translated it this way. But we didn't need to have the word but because we can see it is a contrast. There's the one guarding his mouth. There's the one opening it wide. There's the result being preserved. There's the result coming to ruin. All right? And so notice also the parallel way it's said. The one who guards his mouth, the one who opens wide his lips, preserves his life, comes to ruin. Those are parallel ideas, but the parallel is a contrasting parallel. Okay? And again, don't just because don't assume that it's not because the word but can't be found here in the text, but it is implied. There is a contrasting statement here. Okay? All right. Very good. Brother Manny, I'm going to have you do Proverbs 14, verse 1 here.
Proverbs 14, verse 1. The wise woman builds her house, but the foolish tears it down with her own hands. Contrastive.
And what makes you say that?
It's a contrast between a wise woman and a foolish one. And the one builds her house, the other one tears it down. That too is contrast. And of course, the word but.
Yes. Okay, very good. You guys see all of those? It's contrastive because we have the subject is opposite. The subject in line 1 is a wise woman. The subject of line 2 is the foolish woman. And then the verb is opposite. The verb in line 1 is builds. The verb in line 2 is tears down. Okay, those are opposites as well. All right, so that's something to keep in mind. And notice here, I'm going to throw this in now just because we're going to see this a lot. Notice in line 1, we have a poetic device known as ellipsis. That is where a word or phrase is omitted but assumed or actually implied to be there. What phrase here is omitted?
House.
Her
Her
house.
house.
Yeah, her house is assumed to be in line 2, right?
Mhm.
And with her own hands
Mm.
is implied in line 1.
Mm.
Because these are parallel statements. All right, but again, the characteristic of Hebrew poetry is one of the 3 elements we had was structure, parallelism, imagery, and terseness, shortness. And so this is an example where Solomon could have written, the wise woman builds her house with her own hands, but the foolish woman is another ellipsis here, tears down her house with her own hands. That's what's being stated here. But notice how many words have been taken out in order to have the terseness, the shortness, the artistic quality that we see here. We understand completely these words are here in terms of meaning, but they're removed in places in order for this to flow. The wise woman builds her house, but the foolish tears it down with her own hands. That flows better. That's more artistic. It's more brief. And so I just want you to keep in mind, you will see a lot of this in different ways in Hebrew poetry, ellipsis. And the way we can think of that is another English word called eclipse. It sounds familiar. And the eclipse, an eclipse is what? What's an eclipse?
Covered.
Yeah, covering, right? When the sun blocks the moon, or a more common one is the moon blocks the sun. Okay, we know the sun is there, but the moon hides it. And so ellipse, an ellipsis, this is just how I remember the word. An ellipsis is the same idea. We know it's there, but it's hidden. Okay?
Yeah.
So ellipsis, common poetic device in Hebrew poetry. So again, that's a freebie. We're going to cover that later, but I just thought it'd be helpful to notice that now. Because it will come in handy when we're trying to identify parallelism, because at times some phrases will not be there that we would expect to be there. Okay, Proverbs 14:12. I think Brother Harris, can you do Proverbs 14 verse 12?
There is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. I think it's developmental, Pastor.
Okay.
A result, or it could also be contrastive because of the bad.
Okay, so we have 2 possibilities. Let's I'll put that down, contrastive here too. Another possibility, because we see the word but here. So sometimes that indicates. Let's talk about developmental first. What kind of developmental? You say result?
Yeah, result.
Okay, what line is a result of the other?
The second is the result of the first line. The way which seems right to a man ends in death. Results in death.
Okay, good.
The way, yeah.
The way, okay? But at its end is the way of death. Now, you said possibly contrastive. We have the word but here, which could indicate that. But let's remember, not every time the conjunction does not always tell us what kind of parallelism it is. All right? So for example here, there is a way which seems right to a man. Now if it had said, but there is a path which, this is dumb, but wrong to a man, okay? That would be a contrastive statement where we have the same subject, we have a similar verb, and then the opposite or opposing subjects at times and opposing outcomes. But here we don't have that. We have another kind of statement, don't we?
Yeah.
Its end is the way of death. What is? The way which seems right to a man. That's the word that goes with its. So he's adding more information here. But what he's telling us is what happens in this way that seems right to a man. It leads to the way of death. So it is a result. So your first instinct, I think, was correct. These conjunctions are tricky. Sometimes they might mislead you a little bit. Normally, but is a contrastive word. But what he's contrasting here is just this idea that the way seems right, but actually ends in death. So he's not contrasting the two lines, but what he's saying is that this result comes, and the expected result does not come, but rather a different one comes. So I think result is the best way to look at this. Also, too, because if you have contrastive parallelism, you're going to have matching subjects, matching verbs, and matching objects. Okay? We don't have that here.
Yeah.
In this, the way which seems right. The end is the way of death. These don't parallel each other grammatically. So I think developmental is the right understanding of this. Okay? Is that any questions on that or different ideas?
Tim, I think the word "and" also gives us a clue that it's a result, even the word itself.
Excellent. Good observation. And indicates result as well. Good. I didn't catch that before, but that's like, oh yeah, of course. So yeah, I think this one is clearly the second line is giving us the result of the first, therefore it's developmental. Okay, very good. Proverbs 14:13. Pastor Atong, can you do that one? Read it for us and then tell us what kind of parallelism.
Even in laughter, the heart may be in pain, and the end of joy may be grief. Even in laughter, the heart may be in pain, and the end of joy may be in grief.
This one's a little bit tricky. What I like to do is just sort of, first I assume, well, why don't you go ahead and then give us your thoughts. What do you think it is?
Synonymous.
Okay, and what would indicate
Because of
that?
the word laughter and joy.
Okay.
Pain and grief.
Okay, so pain, I just like marking in different colors because it's pain, grief. What about the verbs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, you see that? Maybe.
Maybe.
And maybe. I think synonymous is a good choice. In laughter, the heart may be in pain. The end of joy, which is a different way to express it, but it's the same idea, right? May be grief. I think synonymous makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, notice here we have the word "and." That make it sound like so. Your first instinct, because you see the word "and," may tell, oh, it's developmental, and it's expanding or adding, because the word "and" usually means you're adding something else. But I don't think in this case that's what's happening. I think it is synonymous. Like I told you, watch out. The conjunctions don't always help us here. Sometimes in Hebrew, there's one letter really that is the conjunction. It's the letter waw or vav in modern Hebrew. It looks kind of like a curved line and vertical line, and that waw, when it's added to a word, it forms a conjunction. Okay, let me just I'll just show you. This is bonus material. All right. Remember I told you in class you get all kinds of free stuff. Let me give you some free stuff. This will make you Hebrew scholars. You will far excel your peers in your Hebrew scholarship from this. Okay, so you can see the can you guys see the, I have the scripture, my Logos open here. Let's look at this in Hebrew. Proverbs, what was it? 14:13. Okay, I'm going to just open up. Okay, Proverbs 14:13. Okay, so here, this is in laughter. This is the heart. In pain is the idea of being pained. And then do you see this little line there? Maybe I need to expand this. Let me see.
Oh, we can see it.
Can you see it okay? Yeah, that line, whoops. That little line there is actually a Hebrew letter, wow, or some call it modern Hebrew, vav. And that wow, when it's attached to a word, and this word here is the word, I think, let's see. I'm rusty on my Hebrew. I think this is the end. Speaking of the end. Yeah, the end. When that little letter, wow, is attached to a word, it then becomes a conjunction. Okay? Wow can also form its own words. Let me see if I can find it used somewhere down here. Yeah, notice down here in verse 16, this word has a wow at the beginning, so it's a conjunction, but it also has a wow in the middle. So sometimes batak is the word there. I think that's sin, the word for sin, or trust. And so, but here in verse, sorry, we're in verse 13, aren't we? Yeah. Oh, that's why I couldn't recognize. Yeah, the end. Okay, that's why I couldn't recognize it. I was in the wrong verse. This wow becomes a conjunction. Now, typically, a conjunction, it's often translated as and, A-N-D. That's the most common translation for this wow, but it also can be translated as but. It depends on the context. Or it can be translated as so, or therefore, or so that. So it's a tricky conjunction because it doesn't always translate as and. Those of you who know Greek, the word kai, anyone familiar with the Greek word kai? That's a conjunction in Greek. It's the same thing. Kai is most often translated as and. That's the most common. But sometimes it can be translated but, depending on the context. But typically kai is usually translated and, sometimes but, sometimes also. But in Hebrew, this wow can be translated as and most of the time, but often it's translated as the word but, and other times as the word so, or therefore, or so that. And so it's a little bit tricky. So especially in Hebrew poetry, every time you see the word but or and, it's probably this conjunction, and really it's interpretive. So we have to keep that in mind. It's a conjunction that's connecting two phrases, but the way it connects can be in different ways. The most common way is the word and, but not always. And so I just want you to be aware of that. If you see the word but in Hebrew or the word and, sometimes it's not exactly the same. It's not different words. So if we go back, in fact, let's look at Proverbs 14, verse 1. Earlier in the chapter, yeah, here's a great example. Remember, the translation of this was, this is the wise woman, right, builds her house. Okay, the wise woman builds her house. And remember, the translation was but, and notice, here's the wow. Normally translated as and, but they translate it as but. Why? Because in the verse, it's clearly a contrast. But the foolish tears, with her hands tears down. Okay? So this is an example of that. The same letter, wow, which is attached to the word, and then means it's now a conjunction, but it's translated in one verse as and in another verse as but. Okay? And the context, really it's interpretive in a lot of times. This is why Hebrew is more difficult than Greek in a lot of ways. Hebrew you really have to understand the vocabulary and understand the context to get this. So anyway, so I just wanted you to be aware of that. Okay, any questions on that? And it can depend also if that wow is connected to a verb or a noun. It can affect the interpretation of it. There's what's called a wow consecutive, which we see often mostly in narratives. And it's kind of like what it does is it connects narrative together, and it's usually translated as A&D, but it actually changes the verb tense. So it gets crazy. But anyway, for the purposes of this exercise, yeah, Brother Tabs, did you have a question or comment?
Yes, Pastor. I'm just curious, Pastor. Are the verbs in Hebrew function differently from Greek verbs, or when you look at them in terms of whether they're participle or things like that?
Yeah, the verbs in Hebrew and Greek are quite a bit different. In Greek, there's 7 or 8 what we would call verb tenses. So you have like aorist, present, future, perfect, pluperfect. So you have these different tenses. In Hebrew, there's only 2. It's the perfect and the imperfect. But the form of the verbs, yeah, you mentioned participle. In Greek, participles are written differently, and the same as in Hebrew. So we can tell when it's a participle versus what's called a finite verb or a main verb. But actually, the tense of the verb in Hebrew is more difficult. There's only 2, and they don't always translate the same. A perfect tense is usually translated in the past, but it doesn't have to be. It depends on context. In Greek, the aorist tense usually is translated past. Greek, it's a lot more clear, but not as much in Hebrew. It's the same kind of thing as this conjunction, where you really have to understand the context to understand how to translate a particular verb. But there is a different way it's written in Hebrew if it's a participle or if it's an imperative. And there's also gender. So there are feminine verbs, masculine verbs. And then in, like, for example, Hebrew, here's an example. Hebrew is constructed interestingly. You see this word here? Boyada'ah. You guys see that? Is it big enough? I've highlighted it. This word actually has a letter beth. That's a preposition. The word actually here is yada. That's hand. Because remember, that's the wise woman, the foolish tears it down with her own hands. Well, that with her own hands is all contained in this one word here. Because yada is hand, and that beth that begins it, this first letter here, is a preposition. By or with. And then this last letter actually is a feminine ending. It's a pronoun her. So with hands plural, her. All right? So in Hebrew, often they'll take a root word and they'll attach
prepositions.
They'll attach, letters at the beginning and the end. And if it's attached at the beginning, it's a preposition or a conjunction. If a letter's attached at the end, it's often a pronoun, a possessive pronoun, her or his or your or my. Okay? So it's
Thank you, Pastor.
very different than in Greek. In Greek, the prepositions are always separate, almost always. And the possessive pronouns are almost always a separate word. Okay? So that's what makes it confusing, because you look at this Hebrew word and you're going, okay, is this Hebrew word start with the letter beth, or is this a preposition? You know, and if you don't know your vocabulary, it becomes very difficult. So,
Thank you, Pastor. Because I was just following you along with interlinear.
Oh, you're checking on me. Okay.
No, I was trying to understand their. I was curious about. I was following along with you, and I was looking at it from the interlinear. I was curious about the verb forms because I don't see like participles, or that's why I asked.
Yeah, it's like I said, they're more challenging for sure. And you notice in this word, this wow here is used very often here. We see it here, it's in the next line. In this word, it's in the next line. Whoops, I can't. And it's often connecting the phrases. So this is line 1 here, and then line 2 with the wow connector conjunction. Line 1 in verse 3, and then line 2 in verse 3, and again it begins with that wow connection. In verse 4, line 1, line 2. Do you notice that? So we see this conjunction wow in almost every verse. That's common in Proverbs. Okay? And it can be, again, translated as and, or but, or so, or therefore, for the purpose of, in order that. So it's a little tricky. Okay, well, that's your bonus today. All right, this morning. Let's get back to our, unless there's any other questions. Are there any other questions? That's enough Hebrew for today? Okay, all right. Let's get back to parallelism. And we are now, let's see, Jason, let me have you do the next one. Proverbs 14:17.
A quick-tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of evil devices his hatred.
Okay, so how would you, what kind of parallelism do we see here?
I lean towards synonymous.
Okay, and why? What would make you?
The quick-tempered man and the man of evil.
Okay, so you're comparing, quick-tempered man, man of evil devices. Okay. Now let's look at the other. Acts is the verb in that one. Is in this one. And then foolishly versus hated. All right, would you see those as synonymous?
I lean towards also developmental.
Okay, if it's developmental, in what way? What develops what and how? Which line develops which line and how does it develop it?
Kind of expands the line 2 expands the line 1.
Okay, so it's adding something more. What do you guys think? Which one would you guys see it as, and why?
Yeah, I think it's also developmental because the idea is not really very it's not the same, so it would not fit the synonymous.
Yeah, if it had said something like, and an angry man what would I say, works evil or something like that, that would be more of a parallel, synonymous parallelism. But here, notice the first statement is that he acts foolishly. The second statement is that he is hated. I think that's a different concept, and I would agree. I think your second inclination is correct, that line 2 is adding more information to line 1. It's expanding on it. Okay?
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. let's see. You guys keep moving around me. Doc Quinn, let me have you do this one. Proverbs 14:19.
The evil will bow down before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. It's a synonymous parallelism passage.
Okay, and what tells you that?
The line 1 is similar with the idea stated in line 2. The evil is parallel with that of the wicked will bow down before the good. The word will bow down is like implied on the second line, will bow down at the gates of the righteous.
Good. So you notice remember, what do we call that?
Ellipsis.
Ellipsis.
Yes, sir.
All right. So we have will bow down is not in the second line, but it's implied. And then we have before the good and at the gates of the righteous. Yeah, I think synonymous is exactly correct. All right. But again, notice ellipsis came into play. The verb bow down was in the first line, but it wasn't in the second, but it was implied that it's there. Because otherwise, what would this mean? If we take this out, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. Well, if there's no verbal idea there, that sentence makes no sense, correct? So we know that there's a missing verb, and because we're looking at poetry and we're looking at parallelism, that missing verb is going to match the word from line 1. Okay? So good. I'll just put it in. And it's left out because the poetry, Hebrew poetry wants the shortness, the brevity. Okay, very good. Brother Gary, are you there?
Yeah.
Hi. Good morning.
Morning.
Could you
Yeah.
try Proverbs 16:3? Can you see it? Go ahead and read it, and then just tell us what you think.
It's synonymous.
Okay, could you read the verse first, and then?
Commit your word to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Well, I think it's developmental.
Okay, and how?
The commit your word, and then your plans will be established.
Yeah, notice here the verb, the action is you commit your works, and then it gives us what in the second line?
Yeah, your will be established, or your
So how does
plans will be established.
How does line 2 relate to line 1? What is line 2 doing compared to line 1?
It develops the action.
Okay, and how? Remember, we have the 3 options. We have expands, we have explains, or we have the reason or result.
Result.
Yes. Line 2 is a result of line 1, isn't it? Yeah. If you do this, and notice there's really an implied if. If you commit your works to the Lord, your plans will be established. Okay?
Yep.
All right, you guys see that? Does everyone, any questions on that? Good, that one was a little bit tricky. All right, let's go to the next verse, Proverbs 16, verse 4. I don't know if Brother Raleigh has sound or not. I think he mentioned earlier he's having trouble with that. Brother Raleigh, can you hear us? Okay, maybe his sound is not working. All right, I'll go back up to Pastor Renee. Have you do Proverbs 16, verse 4. Are you there, Pastor Renee? Looks like he's frozen. Uh-oh, we're having internet problems. The evil one is attacking. All right. Oh, there we are.
Developmental.
He's good. Did you read the verse already, Pastor Renee? Uh-oh.
The signal is experiencing traffic.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. Can you read the verse and then tell us? Are you there? Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
I'm not sure if he heard you.
Okay, maybe we're having technical. Pastor Robbie, do you want to take over?
It's developmental.
Oh, there he is. Oh, he's cutting in. Okay, we'll go with it. Developmental. How does it developing? What kind?
It expands.
Okay.
Expands the first line.
Okay, here's an interesting one. All right. Is it adding more information?
Illustrate.
Or illustrate? Yeah, I think actually this is line 2 is actually illustrating line 1 or explaining. See this? Look, the Lord has made everything for its purpose. And then he gives an example. Even the wicked for the day of evil. Okay? So implied here is the Lord has made the wicked for the day of evil. That illustrates or gives an example of line 1. Okay, so I would say that that this is developmental, and the way it's developing it is line 2 illustrates line 1. Okay? I think this is the first one we've had like this. All right. Good. Pastor Robbie, why don't you take on the next one here? Proverbs 16:18.
Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before stumbling. It's synonymous parallelism.
Okay, and what tells us that?
Well, pride and haughty spirit are synonymous.
Those are synonymous.
And before destruction and before stumbling are synonymous.
All right. And then the verb in the second line
goes is an ellipsis of goes.
There you go. Okay. Yeah. Again, because we know there must be a verb in the second line, because a haughty spirit before stumbling makes no sense by itself. So we know there must be a verbal idea, and because we're talking about Hebrew poetry, it's parallel. So yeah, this is clearly a synonymous parallelism between the two lines, describing repeating a similar idea, but describing it in a different way. Okay. Proverbs 17, verse 14. Brother Manny, we're back to you. Go ahead and read it and then tell us.
The beginning of strife is like letting out of water, so abandon quarrel before it breaks out. It's developmental.
Okay. And how does it develop? Which line develops which line and how?
It expands the idea. It's telling you this is true, so the proper course of action is this.
How do these two lines relate? I agree. Developmental is what's going on here. So which line is developing which line and how? Is it line 2 developing line 1 or line 1 developing line 2? And how?
It's line one, line two developing verse one. It's like adding information that the line one is true, so the proper course of action is line two.
Okay, so is that expanding or adding? Or something different here? Is line 2 just adding more information to line 1, or is the relationship different? This one's a different one. We haven't seen this yet.
Pastor, I think line 1 illustrates line 2.
Yes.
Okay.
Because I think line 1 is an illustration because of the phrase is like letting out water.
Okay.
So he's illustrating that the strife is like letting out water, so better abandon the quarrel already.
Okay, notice this word so.
Reason.
Yeah. Now this word so is that conjunction wow. But here the translators did not translate it as and or but, they translated it as so. Right? Or therefore. And I think that was a correct translation. And here's why. Here's the main statement. Abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. Okay, that's what he's telling us. Why? Why should we do that?
Because the beginning of strife is like
Yeah.
letting out water.
I think line 1 actually, line 1 is the reason for line 2. Why? In other words, why should we abandon the quarrel? The reason? Because the beginning of strife is like letting out water, which is an image, isn't it? It's like a dam breaking. Like when you let out water, you can't stop it. It's going to go where it goes. You can't control it, right? That's the image. And so he's saying, don't start a quarrel. Stop it before it breaks out, because when it breaks out, it's like water breaking out. So it is like an illustration, but I think line 1 is actually giving us the reason through the means of an illustration or a metaphor of why we should do line 2. See that one? This is a little bit complicated. But does that make sense? And that's why the translators put so in line 2, because they see this relationship that line 2 is line 1 is giving the reason for line 2. Why should we do line 2? Why should we abandon the quarrel? Because when you don't, it's like letting out water. Okay? What do you guys think? Do you see that? Does that make sense? Any questions? Or you can disagree. Everyone's okay with that? Okay, you understand? All right. So this is how I would describe it, that we have the line 1 is the reason for line 2. And notice a couple things we haven't seen before. One is that in this case, the first line is developing the second line. Before in the verses, it was the second line developing the first. But in this case, actually, the first develops the second, because the first gives us the reason or the purpose for the second line. Okay? All right. That one's a little bit of a challenge. All right, another one. Proverbs 17, verse 18. Atong, can you tackle this one? Proverbs 17, verse 18. Oh, you're muted still, brother.
A man lacking in sense pledges and becomes guarantor in the presence of his neighbor. Developmental.
Okay, and what way do you see it?
Where the line 2 explains the result or
Okay,
gives the result.
line 2 gives the result of line 1.
Yes.
Yeah, what happens when a man lacking in sense pledges? This is what happens. He becomes a guarantor. So he's now responsible for what he has pledged, what he has vowed. So I would agree. Line 2 is giving us the result. What happens when the person does line 1? Okay? All right, good. Proverbs 17:25, Tabs, back to you.
Sound. A foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her who bore him. The foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her who bore him. I think it is synonymous.
Okay, and why would you say that?
Because of the grief and bitterness.
Okay, so we have grief, bitterness. Those are similar synonymous ideas. Anything else that's synonymous here?
I think the subject, which is the object, or which is the parents, the
Okay, to his
father, and
father.
to her who bore him would mean the mother, and
Yes.
then the implied subject is the foolish son.
Okay, good. So
The foolish
again,
son is.
so this is what you're saying?
Yes, Pastor.
Yeah. Yeah, good. In this case, notice there was ellipsis again, and foolish son was the subject is left out, right? There's no subject in the second line written. Bitterness to her who bore him makes no sense if there's no subject, but we understand that that's implied, and it is parallel. Grief, bitterness to his father, to her who bore him. And notice, this could have said to his to the, I don't know, another term for father here. But notice here, it refers to his mother. So even though those are two different people, it's still a synonymous idea because it's one parent and the other parent. Okay? All right, good. All right, one more, and then we'll get to Psalm 98. All right, Brother Harris, we're back to you. Proverbs 19, verse 8. You get the last one here. So you better get it right.
Proverbs 19:8. He who gets wisdom loves his own soul. He who keeps understanding will find good. This is difficult. He who gets wisdom loves
Well,
his own soul.
let's break it down. All right, he who gets and he who keeps. All right, and then we have wisdom, understanding. And then we have the next phrase is, all right, do those seem to have a relationship?
Yeah, except the third, the first two are very much related, but the third seems to illustrate, or it may also be so developmental, but the kind is expansion.
Okay, line 2 expands line 1. Will find good. Well, think about this. Loves his own soul, will find good. Are those similar ideas? I mean, could this be that last phrase is saying something similar but in a different way? Because notice the first two are exactly matched, don't they?
Yeah.
He who gets, he who keeps, wisdom, understanding. So it could be synonymous, or if it were developmental, I would say line 2, you know, that line, that these two phrases, how would they relate? Loves his own soul will find good. How does he find good? I think it's the synonymous. I think that would probably be the best way to look at this. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, but yeah, it can also be it can also line line 2 can also illustrate line 1. In what way? Yeah, in what way?
Okay, maybe how
does he love his
how he loves his own soul. Okay, that's a possibility. I would say that's more likely than expansion if it's developmental.
Yeah.
So here we may have, maybe there's two possibilities here. Okay, I would probably lean towards synonymous, but developmental is a possibility. All right. Okay. All right. I know there's a lot of examples, but I wanted to go through those because I wanted you to see all the different kinds of parallelism. Now, we didn't do any chiasm here, but we'll get to those at another time, I think. Okay. Well, so let's now turn our attention towards how we do parallelism analysis. All right. Those were just several examples of the kinds of parallelism. How we do that parallelism analysis is, the first step is to identify how many lines are contained within each verse. All right. Does the verse have 2 lines? Okay, and if you're a fancy like Hebrew Old Testament poetry scholar, you would say this: 2 lines is a bicola. All right. Is it bicola or 3 lines? Guess what 3 lines we would call? Tricola. Okay. If it's 4 lines, we call that Coca-Cola. All right. So this is so we want to identify how many lines. Is the verse bicola, tricola, or Coca-Cola? Usually, now all the verses we looked at were all what? The ones we did all those examples for. 2 lines, 3 lines.
Bicola.
They were all bicola. Ooh, all right. We have a Hebrew poetry scholar in the making here. Yeah, they were all bicola, but that's not always the case. All right, I chose Proverbs, and Proverbs is typically that way. Those are called aphorisms. Those 2-line wisdom statements. So they're bicola, but that's not always the case. In fact, we're going to find in Psalm 99 that there are more verses that are non-bicola, that actually have more than 2 lines. All right. The second thing we need to do then is to identify the type of parallelism used in each verse. Okay. So first we just go through the psalm, identify the number of lines. Then we come back and identify the type of parallelism like we just did in the previous exercises. And then the third step is essentially to compare the types of parallelism used within the poem. That is, we take a look at, after we've done the parallelism of each verse, step back and ask, is there a pattern here? Sometimes you'll see a psalm where you'll have a pattern of almost every verse is, say, synonymous, but there's one verse that's contrastive. Or every verse or most verses are developmental, but there's one verse that's synonymous or contrastive. So sometimes there's a pattern, not all the time. But also, too, if you notice, most of the verses are developmental, that's more of an instructive style. Developmental is giving more instruction. So we might see that more in a wisdom psalm. If it's synonymous, that sometimes indicates emphasis, repetition, which shows emotion. So I have you add the third step here to compare. That's just examine, see if there's a pattern. There isn't always one, but it's good to step back, and sometimes there is. Sometimes the author, I think, intentionally uses a different kind of parallelism at some parts of his poem as a point of emphasis. All right? So the key step is the second one. That's where we spend most of our time, is actually identifying the parallelism. But what we first want to do is make sure, one, how many lines are we dealing with in this verse? Okay? If it's more than 2 lines, then we could have more than one type of parallelism going on. You could have line 2 synonymous with line 1, but line 3 as developmental of lines 1 and 2. Okay? It can get a little more complicated. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing, sometimes you'll have a poem where most of the verses may be bicola, but you have one verse that's tricola. That's often intentional. The author intentionally made one of his verses 3 lines or 4 lines instead of 2. Or it could be the other way around, that most of the verses in a poem are 3 lines, but then you have 1 or 2 verses that are 2 lines. Don't assume that's random. That could very likely be intentional by the author. All right? So just keep that in mind. All right, let's go to Psalm 99. And what we're going to do first is, again, I'm going to call on each of you. You're going to help me out with this. And I want you to read the verse. And then the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to identify how many lines are contained within the verse. So we're going to go through Psalm 99 and do the first step, which is identify how many lines in each verse. And then we'll come back and go through each verse and identify the parallelism. All right, so we left off with Brother Harris. Pastor Entz, just how many lines are in?
2 lines.
We got 2 lines here. All I did, by the way, men, is I took, this is New American Standard Translation, I should note that. And I just took how they did it. If you'll notice here, let me just show you this real quick. Each translation, oh, let me change the Hebrew here back to New American Standard. All right, so Psalm 99, actually, we'll just do it from here for now. So Pastor Entz says, notice the New American Standard puts 2 lines here, and we'll see that in each translation. They will put a number of lines in the translation, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, verse 1, we see 2 lines. Pastor Entz, I'll just have you do 2 verses here. What about verse 2? How many lines?
2 lines.
2
also.
lines again. And then verse 3, how many lines?
2.
2 lines. Yeah. Okay, I'm not trying to trick you. Yeah, there's 2 lines in each verse. Pastor Renee, what would you say about verse 4? How many lines does the New American Standard show for verse 4? You're muted.
Sorry, earlier I lost my audio.
That's okay. Can you hear me now okay?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, good. How many lines do you see in verse 4?
Verse 4, we have 3 lines.
Okay, and verse 5?
And verse 5, we have verse 5, we have 3 lines also.
Yeah. How about verse 6?
Verse 6, we have 3 lines also.
All right. Bless you. Doc Quinn, let's finish off. How many lines in verse 7?
We have 3 lines in verse 7. Same is true with verse 8, and the same is true with 9. That all have 3 lines on its verse.
Okay, so let's take a look at this then. Let me go back to our notes. All right, so line So what we notice in the translation is basically verses 1, 2, and 3 are all 2 lines.
Yeah.
And then verses 4, 5,
And 6.
oops, I'm going to bring up something in a minute. 4, 5, and 6, let me skip that. 5 and 6 are all 3 lines. Okay, there's verse 7, and then verse 8 is 3 lines, and verse 9 is 3 lines. So here's something that's interesting then. As we look at this, verses 1 to 3, each verse is, okay, we're going to use the fancy word, guys. What is it?
Bicola.
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 Verses 4 through 9, each verse,
Tricola.
tricola. All right? And remember, if we're going to break it down by our stanzas, remember verses 1 to 3 was one stanza, verses 4 to 5 is another stanza, and verses 6 to 9 is a third stanza. So it's interesting. The first stanza, every verse is bicola, is just 2 lines. And then after that is 3. Okay?
Yeah.
You guys see that? So there's an apparent pattern here. Perhaps this might be intentional on the author's part, as he might be distinguishing the first stanza in some way. Okay? We don't know for sure at this point, but it's just something that we should notice. It's an observation we should make, that there is a pattern. That the fact that the first stanza, only the first stanza, and exactly the first stanza, has 2 lines in each verse. But the second and third stanza, both of them have 3 lines in each verse. All right? Now, this wouldn't necessarily be something to pay attention to if, say, for example, verse 5 was 2 lines. Okay, or verse 8. But here we have a clear difference between stanza 1 and stanzas 2 and 3. Okay? So I would just, make note of that stanza 1, that there seems to be a pattern where stanza 1 is bicola, but stanzas 2 and 3 are tricola. Is this intentional by the author? Okay? It very possibly could be. Whenever you see something that appears to be an obvious pattern, that there's no difference, then it's probably a good idea to think, this might be an intentional thing that the author did, something he did on purpose, because he's wanting us to maybe direct our attention to that first stanza in some way different than stanzas 2 and 3. Okay? So I want you to keep that in mind. Now, as we look at the poem, actually, one difference we can see is, notice verses 1 through 3 focus on who is the object here in these verses.
The Lord.
He's the subject. What is the object? The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He's enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, he's exalted above all the peoples. Okay, notice verses 1 to 3, the focus is on who? I mean, it's the Lord, it's saying something about him, but then there's a called for response, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Among whom?
All the peoples.
Yeah, do you see that? The peoples, the earth, all the peoples, let them. So stanza 1 is really addressing the world, isn't it? But look at stanzas 2 and 3. Notice the in where? Jacob and then worship at his footstool. Again, that's a reference to the ark. Moses and Aaron are now being discussed. I mean, who are the specific recipients now? Who kept his testimonies and the statutes? You answered them. Exalt the Lord and worship at his holy hill. Who is the psalmist speaking to in verses 4 through 9? Who is the reference? Is it the whole world? Or is it
God's
specifically
people.
the people of Israel?
Israel.
You see that? So perhaps by changing the number of lines, maybe the author is drawing our attention to there is a distinction in the audience or the people being focused on. Verses 1 to 3 is referencing the whole earth, everybody. Verses 4 through 9 focuses attention on the people of Israel. Okay? So that might be why we see this difference in the number of lines. Okay? Yeah,
Tim?
Pastor Harvey. Yeah.
Well, in your version of the NAS, do you see the clear distinction between stanza 1 and stanza 2, verses 1 to 3 and verses 4 to 5? Because in my version, there are only 2 stanzas, 1 to 5 and 6 to 9. Or are you basing this on the New King James, which has 3 stanzas?
Well, I'm basing it on the analysis that we did last week, and I reviewed it a little bit ago. I'll go back to it before we did all this parallelism stuff. Okay? Yes, the New King James, if you remember last week, we looked at each of the translations, and they were all different. In fact, let me pull it up.
Yeah.
And I'll show you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, the reason why I'm asking that is because when you look at the different translations, the number of lines per verse begins to change.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, so what do you do? Because if you're basing the number of stanzas on the New King James, the New King James has different number of lines per verse.
Yeah, let me address those are two different things. It's related to the same reason, but let me first address the stanzas. When we went through the stanzas last time, we noticed that, let me pull this up.
Yeah.
Let's see, in class. Because this is an important issue that I actually want to spend a little bit of time on here. Okay, here we are. All right, let me pull this up. Thank you for your patience. All right, hopefully you can see what I did here. This translation comparison we looked at last week when we were comparing translations, and the New American Standard, notice it separated it into 3 stanzas. I'm sorry, no. Was it 3? I think I had an error on this. I didn't fix it.
Yeah, in my NASB version, there are only
2. There's 2. Yeah, sorry, this was I forgot to correct this. Yeah, there's 2. 1 to 5, 6 to 9. The ESV had 3, 1 to 5, 6 to 7, 8 to 9. The New King James had 3, verses 1 to 3, 4 to 5, 6 to 9. Do you guys see that? And the space here is what's I'm showing this by. The NIV had 4. 1 to 3, 4 to 5, 6. So basically, if we summarize it, the translations, we looked at five. I looked at 5 English translations. They're all different. This is 1 through 5. So we see there, and remember I told you last week, the stanza separations by the translation, those are interpretive. They're looking at the psalm and they're trying to identify what they think. There's nothing in the original Hebrew that tells us where the stanzas are. All right? This is interpretive. And so that's why I went to sometimes though the translations will agree. Like we may have had 3 translations that are the same. That might tell us, oh, then it's probably that what those 3 translations say is probably correct. But we didn't have that in this case. So we went to the next step, which was look for the structural markers.
Right.
And in this psalm, we had that holy is he. And then we have verses 5 through 9. So this pointed us towards the possibility of 3 stanzas, which all ended with holy is he. And then we had a grammatical pattern where we had the indicative statements followed by an imperative. The last verse of each stanza was an imperative based upon the first verses of each stanza, which were a statement about God. And then the theme was also clearly different in what we believed are the 3 stanzas. Okay, verses 1 to 3 focused on God's greatness, and we could add even among all the peoples. Verses 4 to 5 was a focus on God's justice, and specifically among the Israelites. And then, so with those 3 ideas put together, and that's why I summarized it this way a little earlier this morning, is we have this summarizing. So we have 3, I think, clear reasons to take it as 3 stanzas: the refrain, the grammatical pattern, and the change in theme. Any one of those could be strong support for 3 stanzas, but the fact that we have 3 distinct differences between those, I think, points to 3 stanzas very clearly, and it happens to match what the New King James says. All right? But I didn't use the New King James as the New King James says 3, therefore it must be 3. The New King James, the New American Standard, the ESV, the NIV, they were all different. So I went to the analysis of the poem itself to see if there were any clues within the poem, the structural markers, the different patterns, in this case grammar, and then notice the change in theme. So that's how we landed at 3 stanzas, even though each translation was different. Now, we have a similar issue with the number of lines. Let me go back down. And this is very important. I'm glad you brought this up. So we had verse 4 in particular. This is the New American Standard translation. The New American Standard has 3 lines. But if we go to the ESV, this is how the ESV has it. They had 4 lines. If we go to the New King James, it has 3. So which is it? Is the ESV right? Or is the New American Standard, the New King James right? Is it tricola or is it Coca-Cola? Which is it? 3 lines or 4 lines? How do we figure it out? And how do they come up with these lines anyway?
Yeah.
Okay, that's really your question, right?
Yeah, Tim.
Yeah.
In the New King in my New King James, verse 1 has 4 lines. I don't know if it's the same with you. The Lord reigns, and then let the people tremble, and then he dwells, and then let the earth.
Yes. Yeah, I have that too. Let me see. Where are we at? Okay. So yeah, the question then becomes, when we have these differences between translations, that will affect how we do the parallelism, because if you're looking at 2 lines in one translation versus 3 in another, or in this case, in verse 4, we have New American Standard has 3 lines, but the ESV has 4 lines. If you're using the ESV, you're gonna do the parallelism differently than New American Standard. So which is it? And how do they figure out? How do they come up with these lines? Well, what I'm going to do is, let's see if we have time. Yeah, let's do this. Let's do this. All right, here's where we're going to get really advanced, okay? But I think it's important that you're exposed to this. All right, hopefully I'll explain it clearly to you so that you can understand this. Let me first take you, I'm going to open up, we're going to look at the Hebrew again. This is going to be another little Hebrew lesson, all right? So you guys didn't know, I'm going to make you Hebrew scholars before we finish this class, all right? All right, so here I have now my Logos pulled up. Let me go to the Hebrew text, and I just want to highlight for you, and let me see, I'm going to expand this a little bit, a little bigger. Okay, now I want you guys to notice something first. Let me go bigger. Okay, now here's the Hebrew text. We're going to look at verse 4. That's the verse that's in, we don't know what's going on here. Verse 4, notice in the middle here we have the Hebrew letters. Okay, that's the big bolded letters in the middle. Those are the letters. And then on the bottom and the top we have these other markings. You guys see that? Now, on the bottom, those are the vowels. So for example, here's Melech. All right, that's the word for king. All right, this is literally the strength. This word is Oz, strength, Melech, actually, a king. Now notice these little 3 dots below. Those are Hebrew vowels. Okay, normally in Hebrew, you just have the consonants. All right, that's these middle big letters. Mem, Lameth, okay, and Kaf. Those are consonants. And then below, these little smaller markings are the vowels. All right, so here's another vowel, mishapat. And this is justice, the word for justice. All right, so this is a vowel, and then this little T is a vowel. Now there's some other markings around here. Notice above there's this little arrow looking thing, and below we've got a slash. Over here we have a slash. And here we have a hat, you know, a triangle. You guys see those? Well, those are called Hebrew accents. All right, just like, you know, in a word, if there's more than one syllable, one of the syllables we accent. I think that's the case in Tagalog, right? You'll have a particular word and you'll emphasize one of the syllables of that word. So, for example, you know, example, zam. The middle syllable is accented. It's how do you thunder, thun. You pronounce thun more than the der. I don't know how to explain this. When you accent a syllable, that syllable is pronounced with more emphasis. It's the same in Hebrew. There's an accent here which tells us which syllable is going to be pronounced more. So mishpat, here's this accent here, so I'm going to pronounce this syllable with more emphasis, mishpat. All right? Now the Hebrew accents not only tell us as we read it which syllables to emphasize, but it also tells us how do we divide up the verse. All right? Let me take you back to the notes on this. And again, if you have questions, stop me and ask. All right? Doc Quinn looks like he's meditating there.
Yeah.
A long surgery, huh? Okay, here we go. Advanced topic. Again, this is beyond the notes we've covered before, but in Hebrew, their accent marks also serve as line divisions within a verse, and there are different kinds. So I just took a few examples here. There's one which is this this arrow with the slash. Okay, another kind of accent mark, which also serves as a verse divider, is this what's called an athnak. It's like it looks like a triangle there. Another count is called a Ravia Gadol, the Great Ravia. All right, and this just looks like a diamond. You see it above there? Maybe I can expand here a little bit. You see the diamond there? All right, that's a third kind of accent which serves as a divider. There's another one. It's called it's another form of Ravia. It's oh, that's why it jumped over. It's a diamond with also a little slash kind of next to it. All right, that's called a Ravia Migrash. That's another kind of accent mark. These four are the more common ones in Hebrew poetry. All right, in fact, and they're in order of commonness. All right, so let's look at, so basically how the translators figure out the line divisions. They're given clues by these accent marks. So for example, let's look at verse 1. We have an accent mark here. That's the athnak. And then we have an accent mark here. If I could move the... All right, you see that? And basically what this means is we have a division here. This athnak tells us that there's going to be a break right here from one verse to the next, one line to the next. So this word here is Yahweh reigns, let the peoples tremble. That's the first line, and we know it is because of this Hebrew accent. So the line ends here with peoples. All right, so that's why the New American Standard has the line ending there with tremble. Let the peoples tremble. Okay, the word order is mixed around in Hebrew, but do you see that? Here's the first line of verse 1. The second line is noted by, he's enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. Okay? Now, this marking is sometimes, and this is where it gets complicated, sometimes these Hebrew accents do tell you where the verse is being divided. Other times it doesn't. And nobody understands the accents fully and completely. So sometimes how they're used, even Hebrew scholars aren't quite sure. But what I want you to understand is there are certain accent marks like this athnak here, which are always disjunctive. They always indicate a division in the line. There are other accent marks like this one, the diamond with the slash, that don't always tell us there's a division there. That gets a little confusing. So the New American Standard and the ESV recognize this little accent mark here as an indicator that we're going to, line 1 stops at let the peoples tremble. And then they did not see this as a divider, because notice this would mean we would divide it here. Let the earth shake. Okay, because this is the chair, he's enthroned above the cherubim. That's what these two Hebrew words translate as. And then these two Hebrew words translate as let the earth shake. All right? Let me keep going, and then hopefully this will get clear as we move on. So what I want you to see from this first verse is, 1, the translators, the New American Standard, did break it at the end of this line. In fact, we could even put, let me do this. This might help a little bit. Insert shape. Let's do this. Sorry, man. Give me a second here to. And then let's make it black. Okay. So this is this is a line division here. All right? And that's exactly where they divided it. Now, line 2, I think, or verse 2 will be a little bit clearer. Notice we have that aphnak. That's a major accent. A major, we call it disjunctive or separating accent. Okay? And it separates, let me take this, copy it down. So that tells us that we need to divide the first line here. Yahweh in Zion is great. And that's exactly what the New American Standard did. And then it took this second line as exalted he is above all the peoples. And that's why it came up with 2 lines. All right? So it just followed the accent marks. Verse 3. Let them praise your great and awesome name. And notice, we don't have that aphnak, that triangle one, but there is the Revia Gadol, here, the diamond that we can see. See that? So that would mean, then, that we should put the first division here. And that's exactly what the translation did. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Notice that's line 1. And then holy is he. Line 2. Or he is holy. All right. And they noticed this little accent here as the indicator of where to split the line. All right. So I'm just going back to, remember I showed you those 4 accents earlier. We had this one, the Ole Weyored, which we haven't seen yet. The second one, which is a major disjunctive, is called the aphnak. The third is called the Revia Gadol. And then the fourth, which sometimes is a divider, is the Revia Migrash. But whenever you see these first 3, it's going to tell you, divide the line here, break the line here. All right? And so that's what we have. Verse 1, we see that aphnak, and so it's telling us break the line there. That's what the New American Standard did. Verse 2, we see the aphnak again, that triangle-looking hat. So that tells us break the verse right after that word. And that's what the translation did. Verse 3, we see that, in this case, we don't see the aphnak, but we see that Revia Gadol, the great Revia. And that tells us break the verse right after that accent mark. And that's what the translators did. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Break. Holy is he. Are you with me so far? Just say you are and make me feel good, even if it's confusing.
Yep.
But the point I'm trying to make is this, man. There are accent marks that serve as indicators for where to divide the verse. All right? And there's 4 that I've shown you, 3 of which are the most common that tell us to divide the verse. Now, when we get to verse 4, this is the one that was different between the ESV and the New American Standard. In verse 4, we have this Ole Weyorev. Remember that first one I showed you?
Yeah.
We see that here. So that tells us, hey, we need to divide the first line here, which is the strength of the king loves justice. All right? That's what the New American Standard did. It stopped the line at the end of justice. Now, again, the word order is different. Literally, it's strength and the strength of the king justice loves. All right? But it's still, that phrase was kept together in the first line. Now, the second line, notice, brothers, we have an aphnak here. You see that?
Yeah.
So that tells us boom, baby, we've got another line division here right after this.
Mm-hmm.
You yourself established uprightness. And look what, they translated it equity, but that's what the New American Standard did. It followed these two signs. And again, these two accents are called major disjunctive. That means they always divide. All right? They're anti-unity. They're disunity accents. All right? They divide. All right? Now, we have another accent here. It's called that Revia Migrash. Sometimes it's disjunctive, other times it is not. In this case, the New American Standard said, God, you have to do this. Sorry, man, let me pull this up so we can see it. All right. All right, in this case, the New American Standard did not divide it there. Just like it did not divide that accent in verse 1. Again, we see it here. Notice it's here, but the New American Standard said it doesn't divide there. All right, that's an interpretive decision. And then again, in the second verse, verse 2, we also saw one of those accent marks. And notice if we had divided it here, it would have been, the Lord is great in Zion, and he is exalted. It would have been this.
Yeah.
If we had seen that accent, said, oh, we must break it there. Therefore, let's put a break here. And we do that, but then notice what happens when we translate it. He is exalted, and then above all the peoples is by itself. But that doesn't fit. That doesn't make sense. All right? This line should be all together. And that's why the New American Standard said, in this case, this accent is not functioning as a divider.
Yeah.
And so they said no. And I think rightly so.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And then we get to verse 4, where, again, the New American Standard, they're confronted with this accent. But notice, if we divide it here, if they say, oh, look, there's that Revia Migrash accent, so we must divide it here. And if they had done that, it would have been this. Literally, justice and righteousness would have been its own line. You have executed in Jacob. All right? And that's what, if we go to the ESV, that's what they did. Well, they actually did something weird. They put you executed justice
first, before.
First, so they didn't even divide it right. If they had divided it right, it would have looked like this. Let me do this instead.
Yeah.
Let me make it more explicit here. Okay, this is a New American Standard. Now, if we had said that this accent here, this Revia Migrash, should have a divider, this is how we should have translated it. All right? But the ESV didn't even do that. It translated it in a weird way. It divided it strangely. So I don't know why the ESV did that. If they had to use this accent mark here as an indicator to divide, they should have divided it like this. But they didn't. So I think the New American Standard was being consistent by saying, no, this is not a marker that's telling us to divide it here. And they went with 3 lines. And by the way, men, every other verse in verses 4 to 9 is how many lines? 3. So I think this was a correct interpretation of the accent marks for 2 reasons. One, that this type of accent marker is not always a disjunctive marker. It's not always saying divide the verse here. Sometimes it does, but not always. And secondly, there's a pattern. Verse 4, verse 5, verse 5, verse 6, verse 7, verse 8, and verse 9 are all tricolor. And verse 1, verse 2, verse 3 are bicolor. So I think verse 4 is tricolor. It makes sense. And also, even the way you'd have to translate it or divide it would be like this. It would stick justice and righteousness out. And you have executed in Jacob would be dangling. Mm-hmm. You've executed what in Jacob?
Yeah.
You see, it doesn't make sense. So I think the New American Standard is correct. The ESV just, they blew it on this one, in my opinion. Okay? Now, let's look at verse 5. All right, we have 2 accents in this verse. Let me get the divider. Sorry, man, I know this is going slow, but I'm trying to. All right, so if we just follow what all right, these accent marks, notice it's the Revia Gadol, which is usually a disjunctive marker, meaning it usually tells us, okay, divide the verse at the line at the end of this word. Now notice the New American Standard. How did they do it? Exalt Yahweh our God. End of line 1. See that? Worship and worship at his footstool. Again, the Revia Gadol, divider, that's what they did. Holy is he, line 3. Okay? So, and you can go through and the other verses, I didn't copy them. I'll put them in your notes if you want to try it yourself and see if you can match. I would encourage you to do that. Take verses 6 through 9 and see if you can figure out, just by looking at the accent marks, where to divide it up, and then look at the New American Standard and see how they did it. I think in this psalm, the New American Standard correctly divided the lines based on the accent marks. Okay? The New King James, that verse 1, when it had 4 lines, I think there's not 4 accent marks there. There's only 3. So they didn't even divide it correctly there. And in ESV, in verse 4, I think I showed you that it's not 4 lines there. It's really supposed to be 3. Okay? Now, if some of you didn't get that or if it didn't make sense, I will put this in the notes and explain a little bit in the notes. You can read through it. Don't worry about this. What I would tell you is this. If you see a difference in translations where you have, okay, New American Standard has 3 lines here, but the ESV has 4. And, when Pastor Tim talked about all those accents, I had no idea what he was talking about. I don't know what's going on here. What do I do? Well, what I would tell you to do is this. Take the, let's go back up here.
Where's my Google?
I would tell you to do this. All right, you've got this discrepancy. I would say take the New American Standard, the ESV, and the New King James, and go with the majority. So, for example, in this case, the New American Standard had 3 lines. The New King James had 3 lines. The ESV had 4 lines. Go with the 3 lines, because the New American Standard and New King James agree. All right? So just go with the majority. If you don't understand the whole accent thing, don't worry about it. All right? I'm just showing you that so you can see how the translations were supposed to, how they derive the number of lines. How do they figure that out?
Tim?
Well, they go by these accents. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, they don't always agree. Sometimes, like I said, they'll see something that one translation says, oh, this should be an accent, a divider, but that's not always the case. All right. If it's an athnak, the triangle one, or if it's that ole weyereth, which is that arrow with the dash, those always divide. But the other ones don't always divide. And so that's where you might see some differences, or why you might see some differences. But what you need to do is go through your translation and look at count the number of lines, and then take the ESV and the New King James and see how they do it for your psalm. And then, if you see a difference, just go with whichever two translations agree.
Yeah.
All right? Because you'll always have at least two of them agree. Well, almost always. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, Tim?
Yeah.
Can we also say that in terms of the sense itself, it doesn't make sense to divide the third line into two, because the sentence is, you have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob.
Yeah.
Really suited to be in one line.
Yes, I think so. Plus, too, notice, if we are assuming parallelism and we're comparing those two lines, what's the parallelism there? You,
yeah, have established, have executed.
Okay, so are you seeing the?
Yeah.
Right, and then the parallel words equity.
Mm-hmm.
And then justice and righteousness, he uses two there. But we have a synonymous parallelism here, right? But if we go with the ESV, you've established justice. And I guess you could say, well, there's an ellipsis here. You've established righteousness. Maybe you could make that argument. I don't know. But I think this makes more sense. And like I said, when we looked at the accent marks, the ESV actually didn't even divide it in the right place to begin with. So, but like I said, what we can do is if you don't understand all that accent mark stuff, and you don't have to go look at that, just compare these three translations, New American Standard, ESV, and New King James, and go with the majority. And I don't know, 95% of the time you'll be fine. 98% of the time you'll be fine. Okay?
So, Tim, not even the NIV. Because the NIV divides verse 4 into 4.
Yeah, the NIV I really like as a translation to read. I think it's good. It's more interpretive, so it's a more dynamic translation. But I really like it, but not to study.
Yeah.
Not to study. I don't use it for, block diagramming. I don't use it for parallelism. I just don't use it for a study like this, because they're trying to just give you the sense of the interpretation, but they're not careful about following these. Like for this case, they don't follow the accent marks really well. I don't even know if they use that in their interpretation. I just don't know. But I've not found the NIV to be very useful for this part of the process, for the parallelism. But I have found the New American Standard, the ESV, and the New King James to be pretty reliable. So I use those three in this step. So what I'm saying is this. When we are doing counting the number of lines, compare the New American Standard, the ESV, and the New King James. And then for any differences, go with the majority. That is, go with the two versions that agree. All right? As far as number of lines. Does that make sense? I mean, a little bit, at least. What I tried to show you is just where they got these line divisions from, and that was by looking at the Hebrew accents. Now, one other question, and we've gone a little over tonight, but I thought it was important at least to show you this. Where did the Hebrew accents come from? Well, those actually came at a later time by the Masoretes, who were experts in Hebrew language. They added the vowel markings and the accents into the text as a guide for us. All right? So, but we can rely on those accent marks as a useful indicator of where to divide the verses. Now, you will see accent marks also in narrative, not just in poetry. You'll see dividers in narrative as well, and sometimes those accent marks are used to divide a thought. Okay? But in Hebrew poetry, those accent marks are very important because they are what guide us to determine where to divide the lines in the verse, to know how many lines there are in a verse. Okay? And again, I'll have this written down for you in the handout. Hopefully I'll get it out to you tomorrow or the next day, and you can read through that, and then hopefully it'll make a little more sense to you. All right? Okay, well, a lot of information there. I hope it was helpful. But are there any final questions or comments? Again, don't worry about these accent marks as far as your study, and like you have to go through every verse and figure out the accent marks and all that. Like I said, you can trust the translations, especially if you compare those three, and I think you'll be fine, almost all the time as far as that. But I think it is important, if you're just going to use the translations, don't just use one. Because, like, for example, if you just did ESV, verse 4, you're going to have, I think you're not going to be correct. You're going to say 4 lines are there, and there's really only supposed to be 3. So you'll be misguided a little bit. So don't just count on your one translation. I would use one to do your initial study. I use the New American Standard, and then what I did was I looked over at the ESV and the New King James, and New King James had a difference in verse 1, but the ESV and the NAS agreed. 2 lines. The ESV had a difference in verse 4, where it had 4 lines, but the New King James and the New American Standard had 3, so I went with 3. And then I will go look at the accent marks, and I verified that 3 was the correct number to use. But you don't have to verify by the accent marks, but I at least wanted you to know about them. So you know there was a reason for the translators, how they divided their lines. Okay? All right. Well, next week, Lord willing, we will pick up and do the actual analysis of the parallelism in Psalm 99, and using the New American Standard as our guide as how many lines. All right? Okay.
Wow.
Yeah,
Great.
Doc Quinn, you want to close us in prayer? Unless there's any final questions, I don't want to leave you tonight if you have a burning question. You've had enough. Okay, that's fine. Doc Quinn.
Is that really Coca-Cola for lines, Pastor Tim? Is that really Coca-Cola?
No, I think Quadricola or something like that. I don't know. Coca-Cola. I think Coca-Cola sounds more cool, right? It's like Obi-Wan, instead of saying formal parallelism, say, Obi-Wan. Yeah, that's ambut.
What?
But yeah,
Okay.
Coca-Cola is my dumb joke, so sorry.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Pray for us, brother.
Let's pray. We thank you, Lord, for yet another day of teaching.